Hey, I'm Charles with Rocky Mountain ATVMC. Today I'm going to show you how to rebuild the top end on your YZ250 or YZ250X. Rebuilding the top end on your bike can be intimidating, but I'm going to show you how easy it is on this 2009 YZ250. The process will be similar for any late model YZ250 or YZ250X. And a good way to check the health of your top end is by doing a compression test. You can find your specs in your owner's or service manual, and this is also going to tell you when you need to replace the piston. So for this bike, our manual actually recommends replacing the piston every 5 races. But the reason we're actually rebuilding this bike is because we had the motor seize on us. We need to get in there and see how bad the damage really is. So there's a chance we might be going in the bottom end as well. So with all that being said, let's get started. To do this job, we're going to use some rags, safety glasses, rubber gloves. We have some common hand tools. The things worth mentioning are our 2 to 3 inch micrometer. We also have a snap gauge, feeler gauges, a torque wrench. We're using the Motion Pro wrist pin puller. And we also have this torque wrench adapter. This is also from Motion Pro. For parts, we have our Wiseco piston kit. This is going to come with your piston, rings, circlips, and your wrist pin. It does not come with the wrist pin bearing, so we source that separately. We're also using 2-stroke oil, coolant, some grease, assembly lube, and some contact cleaner. And don't forget your gasket set. To gain access to the cylinder head on this bike, we're going to remove the seat and the gas tank, then we'll drain the coolant. All right, so now that we have access to our engine, I'm going to clean this up. We don't want to get any dirt down into our bottom end when we take everything off. So at this point, you can either hose everything off, or what I'm going to do is just use some contact cleaner and wipe everything down really good. All right, now that we have everything cleaned up, we're going to remove our expansion chamber, and then we're going to remove the carburetor. Now with that out of the way, we're going to remove this breather hose. We'll remove this upper hanger bracket. And then from there, we're going to remove the spark plug cap and the spark plug, and then we'll remove this cooling hose. All right, now we'll remove the power valve cover and disconnect the power valve. Now to help remove the power valve, I'm just using the end of a drill bit, and there's a little hole in the side of the cylinder and these tabs on the power valve linkage. So I'm going to set that in there. It's going to keep it from moving while I loosen the power valve. Next, we'll loosen up these cylinder head bolts in a crisscross pattern, and then we'll remove them. Now we can remove the cylinder head. Then after that, we have 2 O-rings in the cylinder, and we'll remove both of those. Now with our cylinder head off, we're going to remove the bolts that hold the cylinder to the crankcase halves, and there's only 4 of them. We'll loosen them up in a crisscross pattern and remove them. Now at this point, we can remove the cylinder, and there's 2 things I want to point out on that. We want to have the piston at bottom dead center, or in other words, at its lowest point in the cylinder, and that way we have enough room to remove the cylinder from the bike. So to get the piston at bottom dead center, you can either use your Kickstarter and keep a hand on the cylinder, or you can remove this ignition cover and use the nut on the flywheel and turn it over to bottom dead center. And just so you guys know what's going on, we actually have a bad connecting rod bearing. So what we're going to do, this thing is almost locked up, it barely moves, and that's why we're using this nut to rotate it over. All right, now with the cylinder out, I'm going to take a rag and stuff this around the piston and into the crankcase, and that way we don't get anything down into the bottom end. Now to get the circlip out, I'm just going to use some needle nose pliers, grab onto it and pull it out. Now sometimes these wrist pins slide right out and sometimes they don't, so if it doesn't, this is where we're actually going to use our wrist pin puller. So to use this tool, we'll install the correct adapter, and we have this nut that goes on the back side, and we're just going to pull that wrist pin through. All right, so now we can remove the piston. We've got a needle bearing in here. We'll remove that. We're going to take the cylinder and the piston, we'll take them over to the bench and start inspecting everything. All right, now that we have the cylinder at the bench, we're going to continue with this assembly, but we also know that we need to replace our connecting rod. So we're going to have to go into the bottom end, and if you need to know how to do that, we do have a good video on how to rebuild your bottom end for your two-stroke. With that being said, we'll go ahead and remove our reed cage. Next, we'll flip the cylinder around, and we're going to disassemble our power valve. Next, we'll remove the covers on the left and right side of the cylinder, and there's a retaining bolt with a collar for the power valve. We'll remove that as well. Next, we'll remove these 3 Allen head bolts from this shaft. And the centerpiece has a retaining tab. And now we can pull on the end of the shaft and remove it. So with that out of the way, we have these 2 springs. Pull those out, and we're just going to lay everything in order. We have these washers on the inside, and then we have the pulleys on the outside. Next, we'll remove the 2 screws right here on this bracket. So we've got this link lever, we're going to remove that. And we'll remove this bracket. Next, we can remove these 4mm Allen bolts. And these are Loctited in place, so they might be a little bit harder to turn. All right, after that, I'm going to remove the barrel valves from each side of the cylinder. Just use a magnet to do that. All right, now we're ready to remove the main power valve. Now that we have the power valve removed, we're ready to clean everything up really good. So we're going to use some contact cleaner, and you can also use some carbon remover to remove some of that carbon from your power valve assembly. And then after that, we're going to move on to inspection. To get everything cleaned up, I'm going to remove these 2 dowel pins, and then we'll scrape this gasket, and we also need to remove this power valve seal right here. And then we're going to use some carbon remover, contact cleaner, and a toothbrush to help remove the carbon from the cylinder and all of the power valve components. All right, now that we have all our parts cleaned up, we can measure and inspect everything. But I do want to point out there's a lot of other measurements in the service manual that we're not going to cover. We're just going to cover the most important steps. So this cylinder from the factory, the size is matched up to the piston, and they should have corresponding letters. So the letter on the piston will be on top of the crown, and the letter on the cylinder will be on the back right here. So ours is a B. It's going to be A, B, C, or D. But what's really critical is that we actually measure the cylinder, make sure these measurements are correct, and compare them to the specs in the book. And then our piston is obviously so damaged we need to replace it. But really what you're looking for is scoring on the front of the piston. We have a stuck ring. We had a connecting rod bearing go bad and cause all this damage to it. And anytime you're in here, you want to replace this wrist pin, the needle bearing, and the circlips. Now keep in mind, the aftermarket pistons aren't going to have that lettering. Some brands you can get in different sizes, and some brands are only going to come in one size. So that's why we're going to want to measure that cylinder. And then we already do have our piston, so we're going to measure our piston to cylinder wall clearance. All right, before we measure this cylinder, we want to do a visual inspection and check for any damage on the Nicosil to make sure we can reuse it. So to check for any damage, you want to take your finger, and if you run your fingernail across the Nicosil and it catches on any gouges or grooves, then it's probably going to need to be recoated. If there's some really minor damage, you can clean that up with some 400 to 600 grit sandpaper. But if there's very many grooves or very much damage at all, you want to get that recoated or replace the cylinder. So ours, it actually has quite a bit of pitting throughout it. And then in this top corner, you can actually see there's quite a bit of pitting on top, and the Nicosil coating is damaged right down onto that corner. So we are going to either need to have this cylinder repaired or replace it. So if this Nicosil is good, you're not going to be able to catch your finger on anything. You're going to see some cross hatching all the way down the cylinder, and it's going to be a smooth surface. So if your cylinder passes the visual inspection, you still need to measure it and make sure it's still within spec. So to do that, you're going to take X and Y measurements. So you're going to take 3 measurements from top to bottom, and that's going to be front to back. And then you're going to turn your snap gauge 90 degrees and take 3 more measurements, top, middle, and bottom, and obviously avoid the ports. And then we're going to write those measurements down, and we're going to calculate our taper and out of round. And as we go through this process, we're actually doing all of our measurements in inches. Now that we have our measurements written down, you need to calculate your taper and out of round. So to do that, the taper is going to be the maximum difference from one of your top measurements to the bottom on either the Y or the X axis. So on ours, the Y axis had the biggest difference, and that's 0.4 of a thousandth. And then also to do the out of round, you're going to take your maximum reading, so 2.6154, and then you're going to subtract the smallest reading, which is 2.6149, and that gives us 0.5 of a thousandth. All right, now we need to check the piston to cylinder clearance, and since we either need to get our cylinder replated or replace it, this measurement isn't going to mean anything to us to this new piston right now. So I'm going to show you the measurement compared to the piston that was in this cylinder before. So to measure this, we have this window right here in the skirt. You're going to want to measure it right here across that area just above it. We'll take our micrometer, get our reading. Now to get our piston to cylinder clearance, we're going to take the measurement of the inside diameter on the cylinder, which is 2.6154, and we're going to subtract the outside diameter of the piston, which is 2.6124. That gives us 3 thousandths of an inch. So the spec on this bike, it's 2 thousandths of an inch to 4 thousandths of an inch. So 2 thousandths is standard, the service limit is 4 thousandths of an inch. We're within that spec, but we have obvious damage to our parts, and therefore we need to replace those parts. All right, now we're just going to do a visual inspection on our power valve parts. And as you can see, we have a broken chunk right here, so we're going to need to replace this piece. You want to inspect your springs, make sure they're not broken or damaged. And then we have some pins right here. You want to make sure that these arms, there's not a lot of play in them, and that the pins are round. And then where the pins ride, so this track right here, this is actually worn down pretty good. And to have the power valve operate properly, you want these in good condition. So we're probably going to be replacing these as well. And then the shaft, we actually have a bad groove right by where that power valve seal sits. And this was leaking quite a bit of oil from there. So we're going to replace this shaft as well. And then again, we're going to be replacing all of the O-rings and seals and the gaskets. And I do want to point out, you want to look at your reed cage, make sure these reed pedals are in good condition, that they're not chipped or frayed at the ends, and you want to look down and make sure that they don't have any gaps and they're not held away from the reed cage. And then on this intake boot, a lot of times these get cracked. You want to inspect that, make sure they're not cracked, and if they are, you want to replace them. Now, if your cylinder passed the visual inspection, you can run a hone through this that's made for the NICA seal. If you have any questions on how to do that, we do have a video specifically for it, so be sure to check that out. But again, since our cylinder is damaged, we will be replacing it with a new one. Now, if you did choose to hone your cylinder out, you're going to want to run a nylon brush through it in some soapy water. And same thing if you had this cylinder replated, or like ours, we have a brand new cylinder, we're going to run the brush through it anyway, just to make sure we don't compromise our new parts. Now that we have our cylinder washed up, we've dried it off with compressed air, and it's a good idea to put a light coating of oil on the cylinder walls. So at this point, what we need to do is check our ring end gap on both of the piston rings. So we're going to install these into the cylinder, and we're going to square them up with the piston. And I'm just going down about 1/2 inch or so. Now to check our end gap, our minimum spec on this is 16/1000 of an inch. If you don't have that clearance there, when that piston ring gets hot, the ends can actually touch and it'll try to expand out and it can actually catch a port. So this is very important. Most of the time it's within spec, but you want to verify that it is. So we'll go ahead and take our measurement. And on this piston ring, it actually is a little tight, so we're going to have to adjust it up, and we'll do that by using a file. Now I'm just going to take a little bit of emery cloth to the ends of the ring, and that way I make sure we don't have any sharp ends on this piston ring. And then I'm also going to spray off any little metal shavings we have on there. Now that we're in spec, we'll go ahead and do the same thing to the other ring. And I just want to point out, it didn't take very much to get this in spec. It was really just a couple times on the file and cleaning that end up with the emery cloth, and we're good to go. All right, now that we have our end gaps correct, we're going to install new studs on our cylinder. Now, if you're shipping your cylinder off to get replated, you're going to need to remove them. You'll do it the same way. So what we're going to do is take the new stud, and we're going to put 2 flange nuts on it. We're going to jam these together, and then we can tighten the stud down. And then we'll go ahead and do the same thing on all the rest of the studs, and we'll just make sure that they're all bottomed out all the way. All right, next thing I'm going to do is prep the piston for installation. So to do that, we need to install a circlip on one side. So I'll go ahead and get this started, and to get this in place, I like to get it set pretty close just with my thumb, and then I'll use a screwdriver just as a ramp to kind of help finish sliding this into place. You don't want to pry on it a ton. It should just pop down in there. And then you want to make sure that it's seated all the way. And then the other thing on the circlips, you want the opening to be either at the 12 or 6 o'clock position. The next thing we need to do is install our piston rings onto the piston. And I just want to point out, we have piston ring stopper pins right here in each piston ring groove. So you want to make sure that the end gap on the piston ring lines up with that. So when you install these rings, the other thing to note, sometimes on different machines, they'll have markings on the piston rings for which side goes up and which ring is on top or bottom. But on this piston, it actually doesn't matter. We just need to make sure the rings get on. So to do this, we're just going to spread the ring apart the minimum amount to get it onto the piston. Now we need to install the power valve assembly onto the cylinder. So we have this new main power valve, and I've already poured some 2-stroke premix into this cap, and we're just going to apply that to our main power valve. And then I'm going to install this into the cylinder. It has this mark on top that's going to be facing up. And once you have that slid into place, you can install the holder plate. The hooks will be facing up, and the 2 bolts that hold that in place, we're going to use Loctite on them. Next, we'll take these barrel valves. I'm going to put some oil on these as well, and we'll slide these into place. And when you put them in, make sure the flat part is horizontal. That way we make sure we get the link arm installed right. Then we'll do the same thing on the other side. Now we'll take the link rod. We're going to install this and put it into place, and just make sure the link rod is lining up with the pins in the barrels. Then we have 2 screws that go in the top of that link rod. They have that washer behind them. All right, next step, we're going to install the power valve seal. So I'm going to apply some grease to it. Then I'm just going to use a socket to help press it into place. And just keep in mind the markings are going to be facing out. So that cup with the open end is going to be facing towards the inside of the cylinder. Next, I'm going to install this screw and this plate in place. And I'm just going to leave the screw fairly loose right now. That way we can move the plate around just a little bit. And you want to make sure that it sits in its grooves in the cylinder. Now keep in mind, as you assemble the power valve, you're going to want to put lubrication on anything that pivots. So on these pulleys, I'm going to put a little bit of oil down in that groove. And then when you install the pulleys, you want these installed so the groove is facing the outermost part of the cylinder on each one. And you also want, they have the flat part that's going to be facing out. Then we have the link arm in the middle. It has the 2 springs on it, and those springs engage that main power valve. And then we'll install our washers and these springs that go in the middle between the pulley and that washer. So at this point, now I can install this main shaft. So when I do that, I have this cutout right here. That's going to clear the plate that we just installed. And as we install the shaft, we want to make sure we line up each piece one at a time. I'm going to rotate the shaft until the groove lines up with our retaining plate. And then once it does, I can actually rotate this up. So that groove in the main shaft, it's actually going to be facing up. And you'll know it's in the correct spot when you have the screw holes lined up with the openings. And then once we have those 3 screws tightened down, what I'm going to do is back here on the side, we have all that lined up, so we can go ahead and tighten down this screw. After that, we're going to put new O-rings on the barrel covers. And make sure you apply some grease to these O-rings. Now we'll install the barrel covers on both sides. Now keep in mind, the one that has the tube, it's going to go on the left side of the cylinder, and then the one without it is going to go on the right. Next, we'll install our power valve cover, and we're also going to be using a new gasket. Keep in mind the dip is going to be at the bottom on that gasket, and make sure you have the correct orientation on the cover. So we have this facing up, and we'll tighten down the 4 bolts. So on the old cylinder, we had 2 dowel pins. We need to remove those, and an easy way to do it is by using some dikes. And we'll just pry up on these. Then we'll go ahead and install them onto the new cylinder. Now that we have our cylinder prepped, we're going to bring the bike in and put everything back together. Now before we begin reassembling our top end, you want to make sure there is absolutely no up and down play in your connecting rod. If that's okay, you can go ahead with reassembly. If you need more detailed instruction on that, we have a separate video for that. Ours was actually bad, so we had to rebuild our bottom end, and we have a rebuild video for the bottom end as well. All right, our next step is to install our piston onto our connecting rod. So what I'm going to do is take a little 2-stroke oil and I'm going to put it right in here on that small end on the connecting rod, and I've applied some oil to our needle bearing. Set that in place. Then we're also putting some oil on the wrist pin, and we have our circlip already installed on the right side of the bike. So we're going to start with the wrist pin coming from the left side. So we'll set this down into place. And then you'll notice I left this rag in here. That's just going to make sure when we install this circlip that just in case it pops out, it's not going to fall down into our bottom end. So again, with the circlip, you either want it at 12 o'clock or 6 o'clock for that gap. So on this one, we're actually going to put it at 12 o'clock. Then I'm going to work it on as far as I can with my thumb. And then just for the last little bit, I'm going to use a screwdriver just to pop it in. We'll verify that it's popped in all the way around and make sure the gap is in the correct spot. All right, the next step is to install our dowel pins. So on this right side, I'm going to slide both of those down into place. Then we're going to install our gasket. And before I install the gasket, I'm actually going to remove this rag too. Okay, now that we've done that, what we're going to do is install our cylinder. Before we do that, we're actually going to lube up this piston with a little 2-stroke oil, maybe even put a little bit inside the cylinder. And the other thing I do want to point out is when you're installing your piston, you want to pay attention to this arrow on top. So the arrow is always going to face towards the exhaust side. Now before I slide the cylinder on, I want to point out that, again, you want to make sure when you're compressing these rings onto the cylinder that they end up in the correct spot. So you have the pin in that piston ring groove and the end of the piston ring needs to sit right there on it. And to get this slid on, there's a little taper on the end of the cylinder. So you're just going to compress the ring with your finger and then slide the cylinder on. Next, we're going to install our cylinder nuts. We'll torque them down to 30 foot-pounds. Now, to get the front two torqued, we're actually going to have to use a torque wrench adapter from Motion Pro, and it requires a torque correction factor. You can find that on our website under the product. There's a document attached to it. So if you're going to use this, you need to do that. So we'll go ahead and get it done. Now that we've done that, I'm going to make sure the piston rotates freely and nothing's binding up. If anything is binding up, you want to make sure you correct that problem before you go any further. So for us, we're going up and down smooth. I'm just going to wipe off the excess oil from the top of the piston, and then also we're going to clean up this area where our O-rings go for the cylinder head. We'll put those on and torque down our cylinder head. And keep in mind, we're going to have a little bit of grease on these O-rings. Next, we'll install the copper washers and torque these nuts down to 18 foot-pounds. Next, we'll install the reed cage assembly. We're using 2 new gaskets on this one since it's a V-Force 3, and that means we had to pick up the extra gasket on our website under the OEM diagram. Next, we'll connect our radiator hose onto our cylinder head and tighten the clamp down. All right, now we're going to remove the rag from our intake air boot. Then we're going to install the carburetor. Now after that, we can install the upper hanger bracket. We'll install the top 2 bolts with washers on both sides. The lower bolt only has a washer on the side with the nut. We're going to torque the top 2 bolts to 24 foot-pounds and then the lower bolt to 46 foot-pounds. If you removed your clutch cable, go ahead and reattach it now. and then we'll adjust the play in the clutch lever. All right, next thing, you want to make sure these cables are routed correctly. So I'm going to do one zip tie just around the throttle cable. We're going to leave that clutch cable alone. The next step is to install our stator cover. Next step, we'll reconnect our breather hose on that left side. Over here on the right side of the bike, we're going to hook up our power valve. So to do that, first we're going to install the spacer. Then on this linkage, we'll have to pull up on it a little bit. We've got grooves in this linkage and on that main shaft. So you want to line those up. Once that's done, you can install the bolt and washer. And to help snug these down, what we're going to do, if you have the pin that came with your bike, you can use that, or you can use an Allen key or a little Torx bit. Just anything to keep that linkage from moving while you tighten down the bolt. After that, we're going to install this power valve cover, but don't forget to install a new gasket. And to help hold this in place, I'm just going to put a little bit of grease on it so it doesn't fall off. And don't forget that rubber piece that goes on the bottom. All right, now we can install our spark plug and our spark plug cap. Next, we're going to fill the system with coolant. Next, we'll install the exhaust. We're going to service our air filter. Then we'll install the gas tank and the seat. All right, our next step is to start this bike up. We're going to bring it up to operating temperature, check for any leaks, and then we're going to shut it down, let it cool off. And for braking, what you want to do is always refer to your model-specific service manual, but for us, we're actually just going to take it easy for the first ride or first tank of gas. You want to vary the RPM, you don't want to hold it in one position, and then let the bike completely cool down all the way, and then after that, you should be ready to ride. So that's all there is to replacing the top end on your YZ250. If you need any parts, check out our website. We have a lot of different options on there. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more helpful content. Thanks for watching.